for this tournament, specifically obviously Lichess tournament arena rapid game, we notice, much like the previous upload, a sudden unexpected blunder of a minor piece, a knight, except in this circumstance the game started off with an offbeat version in the English opening, and my opponent tried to actually gain some activity for the lost piece, but it proved to be futile. The loss was too central, too strategic, and there was no tactics to follow it up, so there was nothing to fall back on afterwards. As we can see here, 97. Perhaps helping for d5. I think this is the first time I've played anything like this. Very unusual to see the knight on e7 instead of f6, especially for an English opening. But we continue with the standard fianchetto with the kingside bishop, trying to support d5 and primarily quickly developing the kingside now that c4 has been played. The bishop is not very useful on this shortened f1 a6 diagonal. d6. I was actually surprised that this setup is so solid for black, the so-called giant snake setup. Even analysis of the computer and looking at the database games available demonstrate that this perhaps c5, c6, knight d7 or knight a6 is viable for black, not losing, but it's definitely not gaining the initiative like you would find with the Keres defense with e5 and c6 against the English, which is probably the best one to play if black wants to play for an advantage. But e5 I think in general is the best way to play instead of the symmetrical c5 that I have rather good results against, I think. And we continue. Castling b3, and another thing I should mention here is there's all these alternatives I could play as white instead of kingside fianchetto, including earlier d4, earlier e4 and transpositions. But this is a deliberate setup, trying to play as purely English as you could without having any kind of transposition to standard d4 lines or even things like the London system. So typically the positions are more strategic, less tactical. However, obviously in every chess game the tactics and the positional play, it's more or less, the same thing. I can't see why it's so common that people distinguish between the two when you need both for the mechanics of the game to work. Either way, c6, d4, now that my opponent has not committed at all to this kind of setup to combat the center of c5 or d5 immediately. But it means he has much less space. 97, very passive development of course for the bishop, for the knight. But I maybe would have preferred knight a6 with an immediate c5, seeing what white does, and then responding with a kind of b5, and then avoiding the whole fianchetted bishop on this diagonal. h1, a8, e4, occupying the center where black has not Apparently this is all been played before. I really don't know anything going on here except black is very passive and white has a very sensible and easy development. Knight b6. Probably something you see from the modern defense, the Pietz defense, but yeah, like the modern defense for black. He tries to support d5 now that white occupies it so strongly. Again, I'm selecting here perhaps not the most accurate move, trying to play too much into a system, or choosing to play into a system. Less about accuracy, more about decision making. Forgetting about whether you're playing English opening, Queen's Pawn, something like Bishop e3 is probably the best approach. You have solidified your queenside pawns, you can get your rook away from this diagonal for the black bishop that has been left open by this early knight move. So things like c5 are still quite strong, and it's probably not the best reply, but we can see c5, queen e2, exchange, and the game continues. Complicated. d5 is probably the main line, supporting the whole reason why your knights are placed in this way. But if this c5 continuation is played after you already wasted a move, capturing with a knight is not so good. d5 comes, and this bishop is coordinating harmoniously with a few of black's pieces. Some of the lines of the bishop takes counteracting. The fianchetto is perhaps the best. The exchange occurs, rook 81, and again white emphasizes the central control, while black is undeveloped, much like we saw in the previous game. Knight c6, avoiding all of these intricacies, playing a type of Aljekan in a very funny situation. But again, pawn structure is more important, so it looks almost like a Sicilian Taimanov. Could be a Najdorf if e5 gets played. But you will exchange the bishop, of course. Maybe you move a knight to d4. Could be a few options. But I think ultimately the game would have been more dynamic, more interesting. And of course, this queen c7 move might sometimes fall into knight b5. Exchanging, and white will have the initiative again, with all sorts of ways of continuing. Back to the main game, queen c2. So the setup I'm choosing is, of course, this bishop facing off against its black counterpart. d5, and again, here's the blunder. For some reason, my opponent captured with the knight. My guess is they thought something like this would happen. First capturing with the pawn, maybe advancing, but this is why it's a pre-move, I guess. Capture, and then they can recapture. But that's why you're not supposed to pre-move in these types of situations, because it's unnecessary. It's more than one capture. Either way, I was pretty happy to see the blunder, but it's one of these weird situations where it's not immediately obvious how to convert your extra material advantage. The fianchettoed bishop on the king's side for black is a good defense, and the white's king side, unlike the previous game, in this one can't really participate, neither in the center because of these types of pawns and knight presence and the loss of most of the impact you could have had from flank pawn advances. And you will see that's why I'm showing this game, and that's why it's titled the way it is. It's very plodding. You have to take your time. A lot of the moves look artificial. Perhaps they are artificial. The computer doesn't know what to do, suggesting repetitions if you keep it for a while. A lot of transpositions. It almost doesn't matter. You just have to make moves until black causes weaknesses. His position is very poor, very deficient. Without the minor piece, black really has no superior counter chances or counterplay to hope for. White is very solid. The exchange opens. Black opens this bishop, but the bishop will do almost nothing the entire game. It's just hoping for some counterplay, and this is one of the key points. The question would be, after this capture, you can think about moving your rook, moving a bishop, perhaps you can think about plans of moving your knight in this way. I don't know, I mean, there's really no obvious targets you can punish or exploit or even create. However, already in this position, of course, you can look at this setup in conjunction with your bishop on g2. If this knight moves and b6 is played, white can exert a lot of force on c5 and c6, further pacifying black's position. So I play bishop g5. It's not a special move, it's just gaining time on the queen, asking black what's going to happen. And there's a few moves that look sensible, but are not really. The best is not queen d6, but it makes sense, right, if you don't want to move your pawns. However, you walk into something like bishop f4, improving the dark square bishop for white, away from a vulnerable square. It's a vulnerable square, like, in the least serious sense. Queen c7 looks standard, but again, bishop f4, and you move. Queen d8 is like the best way of doing this, but white has already gained a lot of time, just plays rook f1. If queen e7, again, rook f1, just winning time. I'm just showing this variation because the queen is attacked a lot of times, and that's why. And something like queen d7 after bishop g5 just blocks in the bishop. This queen can't do anything. Therefore f6, asking white to move, and then black will react. I go all the way back to e4 to avoid g5, g4. I don't even know if it's serious. Also, was there something very significant? I don't think there was something very significant, you know, not going to f4. But it's one of those things, you know, you can't be forced to do anything here. So we play a little bit more passively. The bishop isn't attacking anything here. And the grand scheme, you stopping black from pushing c5, for instance, in a very abstract way. Bishop f5, defended by the pawn. Again, white gets changed to array without any problems, and again you will see why bishop e3 after queen d2. There's no tempo gaining with g5, and now I can try to exchange the bishop because I'm a piece up. Exchanges in this powerful position for white, where white has the initiative, where white has all the best aspects of the game. Makes sense. Queen d7, mimicking white as if black could afford to exchange. As if this really helps, but you have to connect the rooks. Black doesn't have too many options. Rook f1, nothing special. Knight relocates. Knight a4 is not I guess the best move. Rook c1, h4 even, working against this, or just bishop h6. But there's so many moves, you don't have to be rushed. And look, unforced error, unforced weakness creation. A plodding way to play, to convert where technique is almost not the primary importance, simply because black's position is that bad without the extra material. There's no compensation here for black. I think if you see from this, the position is already worth more than the exchange, the loss of a pawn, the loss of a knight. It's almost like white is gaining compensation, almost as if black is losing a pawn in addition to the knight. Knight d6, there's a lot of moves. The computer suggests just playing for knight c3, like this sample line. Everything I've spoken about, and you just try to exchange everything, and the computer does something like queen e6 or queen e8, but obviously queen e8 makes the position less active. It's all just a formality at this point. Queen e6, you're just losing anyway, so the suggestion doesn't really help at all. Queen e2, thinking about coming to e7, which is a weird idea. Why? Rook a8 or whatever, and you have to move your queen again. I just knew that there was basically nothing going on here. Just moving the bishop. And it's because of these queen moves you can really see why this would have made much more sense to implement instead of this quasi abstract interpretation of the queen side. I go all the way back, which looks silly. You can see white is losing quite a bit of advantage with all of this nonsense maneuvering. But I wanted to keep e2 in case I move my knight. Then there's a check, weakening my pawns. Now I don't have the variation. I think it was one of those things you just see while you're playing, and it turns out to not be possible even. So I tried to do something on the queen side and it failed. No success, but I'm still better. You will see how quickly it goes bad or poorly for black. All the standard moves that black has, g5, h5, really trying to make it look like there's counterplay, and in some of the lines maybe there's counterplay. Oops, chasing away the knight. Black ignores it, which is fine. I just exchange. Practically bishop takes would make more sense to keep the center a bit solid, but with the c4 square, weak pawn, there's really almost not that much to say anymore, because there's really no counterplay explicitly from here. So let's go quickly. And with something like f3, maybe it looks scary, all of these pawn advances, but before they can play this, and that's also why it's important to have the queen here, you can exchange if the pawn advances, but also to keep the queen active and the rooks on these squares and files. But everything is just collapsing. Again, black is trying actually in this game to gain some activity, which is nice, you know. I think it was the same tournament as that other game, but unfortunately it's just not going to work. with a little bit of a threat, keeping everything solid for white, asking about the exchange, which will only favor white, and let's say black does something stupid, is winning the queen. You have to be careful. Exchange happens, the rook looks threatening, they are coordinating, and that's also why the queen's here. I was a bit paranoid. I don't know, this bishop move just helps me to actually prepare this advance for d5. And there's a lot of ways to win. The computer suggestion, queen f3, I really like this move. Supporting knight f5, supporting d5. But really a lot of things are possible. Queen h3, the last move, black can really try, and you get attacked. All the squares covered, and you just lose. Bishop f7 after queen f3 is the computer suggestion, and it just shows you how passive black is. Even the ghost of an attack isn't enough to cause any reaction. And even though black is just down a knight, it's now a knight, a pawn, and another pawn's initiative at least. This is not going good. Not going well, not healthy, very sickly. I play queen f5 because queen takes, knight takes. How difficult can it be? Again, you know, it's just, the game just continues. But you see, from this 3.3, white can do better. Queen d6 gets played, I play d5, and black resigns. So I hope it's an instructive game. Bit unfortunate for these kinds of blunders to happen, but I make blunders like this all the time. Not quite as bad as this, but I made a very stupid one in this exact tournament that I'm going to show you next, which is even worse, which is just, it's not even losing material, it's just getting into a forced draw combination. But that's why we play these games, to see what happens, to improve. And I would like to hear what people's opinions are on this type of chess. Thank you very much. See you for the next one.